as you know, being reflective, being thoughtful, enjoying depth. I often think that is slightly maybe should be more highlighted. That it's there is something enjoyable about seeking depth in life, and there's something enjoyable about seeking depth in conversations or in our work or whatever it is, and just like we're doing right now, I think, and that should be celebrated, I think, and should be enjoyed. And
welcome to Sensitive Stories. This episode is for educational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for treatment with a mental health or medical professional. Let's dive in. So Tom, could you start off by telling us your HSP Discovery Story, how and when you realized that you're highly sensitive?
Sure. Thanks for having me, first of all, on your podcast.
So much.
I was really looking forward to our conversation today.
Same.
So I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist, and I, after my postgraduate training in psychotherapy, I started seeing, I worked in London at a private hospital, and I just happened to see a lot of clients, male clients predominantly at the time, who all talked about struggling with their sensitivity. And through this work, really, the whole idea of the book, The Highly Sensitive Men, emerged, which I then started writing. And I think through the writing process, I realized, just a moment, this describes me as well, Yes. So it's so that's how I discovered about it myself. I had never heard about sensitivity or Elaine Aron's research when I was during my psychology degree, or even during my postgraduate degree in psychotherapy. I wasn't, I don't know whether it has changed since, but back then, temperament or personality trait just wasn't considered in the therapeutic training. Of course, it came up in my psychology degree, but not so much in my therapy training. So when I then worked with those men and I wanted to give them something to read, first of all, I didn't know anything about sensitivity. It made me think about sensitivity for the first time reading myself. And then I just also noticed that there weren't any books on the topic. And I just thought, how is that possible? And it seemed to be quite, most books were written by women and seemed to mostly address women, or the female reader, or identifying reader. And I just sort of thought, it just doesn't match what I experience in the consulting room. And that's how I then started writing the book.
Amazing. I think a lot of us therapists or clinicians discover their trait amidst our work.
Yes.
And it just kind of happens, it comes to us because it's not part of the training.
Yes.
It's something that is missing in a lot of programs. And so you found yourself in it.
Yeah.
In this process.
Yeah. And yet I didn't have, I think since I published the book and since I, started working with highly sensitive clients, obviously, what I'm just talking about was quite a while ago. So I met a lot of people who really found discovering that they're HSP, or that they're, discovering their research. I think a lot of people really had an aha moment and a sort of, this sort of describes me. And I didn't have that so much. I sometimes wonder why, but I explain it because I think most of my friends and the people I'm drawn to are very sensitive, and whether they're highly sensitive or not, but I think they're very sensitive. They're quite emotional. Obviously, being a therapist, I think you focus a lot on, as feelings and, processes and reflection. And so I think in a way, I sometimes wonder whether I was just surrounded by a lot of sensitive people without knowing it. And therefore I didn't quite have the, I finally feel understood. Or I think a lot of people sort of describe they feel misunderstood, and then they read the book, or they, hear about the concept, and then they have a sense of, it all falls into place. I didn't have that so much, I think. But maybe because I was surrounded by a lot of emotional, sensitive people anyway, myself included.
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense because you didn't need that understanding as much or that community as much. Your sensitive system sounds like it was already supported. You were able to be
Mm.
emotional and
Yes,
gentle
yes,
and quiet, whatever you
yes,
needed to be. And I've heard that from a few other folks as well, that when they grow up with sensitivity being normalized,
yes,
you don't need that information or that framework as much.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I think it is particularly, I think what you just said sort of came up when I was then interviewing men for the book. So um, when I started writing the book, I wanted to interview, loads of highly sensitive men about their experiences. And you could really tell that there was a massive difference, obviously, between those men who maybe weren't familiar with the concept, but whose sensitivity or emotionality was accepted or um, grew up in a surrounding where it was sort of seen as something positive, or even where it was just okay. And you could really sort of see a slight difference in terms of what that meant, how they felt
Mhm.
about, being sensitive, if that makes sense. So I think they had
Yeah.
often less critical views of their own, less critically, internalized views of their sensitivity or their emotions.
Hmm. I think there's more self-acceptance and needing to kind of pull away those layers of self-criticism, or, we get all these messages, we're too much or not enough.
Hmm.
And you don't have to fight through that. You're already having that base level of acceptance,
Hmm.
which I think is what we're both working towards more people having
Hmm.
from the
Yes.
start. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Because that was exactly what sort of, for me inspired the book. I was like, I just
Mm.
want, men to read about this. And despite it being a book addressed, written about high sensitive men, it is also, it was also really important for me to, to write quite an inclusive book, and a book that obviously, also women can read, or if they want to know more about men in their lives that are
Mhm.
sensitive. So but yeah, so I think the basic motivation was, here's something, read it, it's
Yes.
important, and here's, it's based on research, and it's not some sort of hoo-ha,
Right. Right.
very yeah, stuff.
Exactly. It's based on research and something that you're actively involved in as well, continuing that.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
as I said, I was working in London, and then this idea of the book came up, and I was writing the book. I wrote the book for a period of 2 years while working as a therapist, and I wrote it in German because I'm German, and it felt just a little bit less challenging to write it in German than in English. So the book came the book came out basically initially in Germany, and it was really interesting because I pitched it to 5 publishers,
Hmm.
and 3 of them were like, no, there's,
Yeah.
who wants to read that? Basically, I mean,
Right.
they said it nicer, they said it more
Sure.
nicely, but it was very much sort of a sense of,
Mm.
um, but 2 publishers were very keen, and then they published it, and then it got basically bought. Foreign rights got bought, and
Hmm.
it's been translated since into English and Swedish and Dutch and Polish, and then as this sort of evolved, I was then thinking how to take this further. This whole topic, because I felt
Ah.
it's part of my practice as a psychotherapist, and I've got some ideas, what
Mm.
would be helpful for, therapeutic, highly sensitive clients based on my experience. But I also felt that there wasn't much research done on this.
Hmm.
On this. So, what do highly sensitive clients actually respond to? Based on
Yes.
research, not just based on my impression
Hmm.
as a therapist, as a practitioner. And this is how the whole idea of doing a PhD started, which I started about 4 years ago now. I'm doing it part-time while also working as a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically very much focus on sensitivity and mental health, just because I think it's so, it brings together really the two aspects. My interest in sensitivity I had now for so many years, and obviously my interest in mental health as a psychotherapist, and I just felt, let's bring this together and let's give a PhD a go. And and it keeps me very busy.
Yes.
So yeah.
And this is such an important topic because we are seeing a lot of research come out about the highly sensitive person, but not the intersection of mental health. So I know you're in the early days of this process, but I'm wondering, are there any initial insights or findings that you're seeing?
Yeah, I can't quite yet talk about any
Sure.
findings as such, but what I can talk about is, just the research that I read about and
Yeah.
used for my PhD so far. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the research, I find is so interesting because on the one hand, we know that sensitivity or being HSP correlates with developing mental health issues. So it correlates with high levels of anxiety, of depression, of issues with emotional regulation. There are a couple of studies, but at the same time, it also seems to show that sensitive people respond better to treatment, and I think that is just really, 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 really fascinating.
Yes.
So that the sensitivity seems to be going in both ways. So it's not just, as it's not just being, sensitive makes you more vulnerable. It also might be an advantage when it comes to therapy and the therapeutic experience. And that just struck me as something unexplored, or relatively unexplored. And I just wanted to explore that basically more through my own research project. But it's early days, and I always feel a bit like, can't really talk about it because I don't know enough about it. But but once we've published stuff, then findings, then we will. I'm sure I'll talk more about it.
Absolutely. And it's exciting to hear that you're diving into what it sounds like is the differential susceptibility piece. And that always gives me a lot of hope as an HSP, that I think there's so much focus on how we're more negatively impacted, but we forget the opposite is also true, that not only are we more supported in therapy, but with any positive support or intervention in our lives, that is possible as an HSP, and not forgetting that.
Absolutely, and not falling, I don't know how you feel about this, but I do sometimes slightly struggle with the whole discourse around sensitivity because I feel it seems so binary. And so either it's, as you said, it focuses very much on the challenges and the difficulties of being sensitive, or it goes into the, it's just, it's a superpower, it's amazing, it's this, it's that. And I just feel a bit like, well, first of all, it's a neutral personality trait, and it can be a challenge, but maybe it's also an advantage in some ways. But I just sort of, what I wanted to do with my research, but also with my writing, is just to bring it slightly back into the middle of it, rather than it's this or that, or those extremes I think you sometimes see and hear when you look at stuff online, or I do sometimes struggle with that a little bit. So yeah.
I'm the same. I get very uncomfortable going to either extreme because it's not the reality of the lived experience of an HSP. So I'm curious if you could talk more about what is harmful in living in those extreme views of sensitivity, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think my thoughts are really is that I think if you go too much into, this makes me very special, and I make it other people's responsibility to, to accommodate me and my sensitive disposition. I think it just sometimes has a tinge of narcissism for me. And I think with that, I really struggle personally on a personal level. And on the other side, I think the danger is just really just seeing it as a, as a burden and as something we need to live with. And oh God, it's going to be, it's just a challenge, all day long. And again, I just feel like that doesn't really represent the reality of it, or is a bit simplified. And I just, what therefore struck me as important is to, also to focus on the positive aspects. of course, as you know, being reflective, being thoughtful, enjoying depth. I often think that is slightly maybe should be more highlighted. That it's there is something enjoyable about seeking depth in life, and there's something enjoyable about seeking depth in conversations or in our work or whatever it is, and just like we're doing right now, I think, and that should be celebrated, I think, and should be enjoyed. And so it just feels to me, that is something that hopefully we're moving towards more. Also the sensitivity towards positive aspects in life, like the music and art and nature, but also the social sensitivity and how that can be obviously an asset, but we don't need to go into the and therefore I'm so special,
right.
I'm just a bit uncomfortable with that personally, but yeah.
Same.
But at the same time, you don't need to neglect it or claim it's not there. Of course, these are really beautiful aspects and qualities, but I just think the way we talk about it is important,
It's very important.
Because I think it's also harmful, in a way, because I think then people who are not highly sensitive might think, oh, why are they, why is this person being so, I don't know, overly, do you know what I mean? Sorry, I'm not really explaining very well.
No, but, I know exactly what you mean. It reminds me, I think what you're hinting at is the covert narcissism, right? Where we're kind of elevating ourselves, but also playing a victim role at the same time.
Absolutely.
Right, as a form of self-protection. And it reminds me that, Elaine talks about priestly advisors, warrior kings, and that we all have value. And that when we start to elevate ourselves, we start to distance ourselves and I think forget that we all bring value in different ways.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and that depth piece doesn't get highlighted enough. And it's so important that there's so much available.
Yes, and it enriches life. I feel like, that's what I often try to, to discuss with clients or, is that it really enriches life, seeking depth and being emotional, and thinking a lot about what you're experiencing. It is something that enriches life and makes life more, intense in a way. And I think that is something to be enjoyed.
When you say it makes life more tense, what do you mean? Can you elaborate there?
Sorry, it makes it tense as well, but it also makes it intense.
Intense.
I think it makes it obviously more tense because as you know, we're emotional regulation is so important for many HSPs, and that's what again what the research actually shows, that emotional regulation is really important. The importance of mindfulness maybe as part of that, those emotional regulation skills. So I think it makes it certainly more tense, but I think it can also make it more intense. And by intense, I mean it just sort of makes it more
more rich.
Just adds to more rich. Yeah, it adds it adds layers,
more complexity.
More complex. Exactly.
Yes, exactly. And it makes me think when we're reaching for depth, but then also trying to simultaneously live our lives and do all the things, right? Whether it's parent or taking care of a parent or going to work or going to the grocery store, doing the shopping. How do we find the balance? How do we make space for depth in the midst of life when everything else is happening?
Yes, it's difficult, right? Because sometimes I think also you can sort of find yourself, I sometimes find myself seeking depth in every little conversation I'm having, with a person at the checkout till at the supermarket. And I'm exaggerating a little bit now, but I'm just, and I sometimes sort of think, oh, this is not the right time for it, or I don't have the resource for it, or I've got 5 minutes. Why do I now start this conversation about something really existential? But on the other hand, I think it can also lead to a lot of closeness, and I think can lead to a lot of richness in your interactions. So I think it's a balancing act, isn't it? When is it when is it the right time to do it and to enjoy it, and when is it enriching, and when is it actually maybe just not quite the right moment to engage on that level, with someone else, or the other person might not be ready for it,
Right.
or it might not be the right time for the other one. So I think it's really balancing, I think.
Yeah, we have to be discerning when to
Yes,
go deep and when to maybe pull back a
yes,
little bit.
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious how we can, just thinking what I want to ask. Like, how can we live? So we're finding that balance, but how can we really live well overall? Because there's more, I think, that
Hmm.
needs to be satisfied than the depth.
Hmm.
If we pull
Yes,
back,
yes.
what else do we need to live well?
Hmm. So I think, I mean, so when I wrote the book, as I explained, I wanted to focus on men, so therefore I interviewed 25 men and just got the sense, and I asked them all the same questions basically, and then
Mm-hmm.
I picked some of those interviews for the book, and I think it is really interesting how what I found interesting was how diverse this group of highly sensitive men is. So yes, they were all highly sensitive, but yet they were all there were some common themes which I really sort of tried to identify. But on the other hand, they were also very different, and it
Yeah.
was not a homogeneous group, And so I think living well obviously means different things for different people,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for some of them, it meant a career change, or after they realized they were highly sensitive, or it meant, um, not picking certain partners they were drawn to. I
Right.
remember there was one client who was very drawn to narcissistic or emotionally unstable partners, and so I think it just means different things for different people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think very much again based on what they experienced, what else they experienced around their
Mm-hmm.
sensitivity, or how their sensitivity was viewed, and I think those things shaped then obviously also, the rest of their personality and how they what they were looking for in life.
Mm-hmm. I think you're speaking to something really important there, which is that even if we narrow down to the HSP experience and then we get even smaller HSP male experience, there's still a lot of diversity
Yeah,
of other parts of your experience, your personality, your culture, and your needs. And we really need that to
yeah,
be unique for ourselves. We
yeah,
don't have to put ourselves in a box, even as HSPs.
yeah, absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. Yes, that struck me as really important because I mean, yes, there might be some similarities, but I think it really depended so much on each, on the individual situation, where were they living, what were their circumstances of their current
Mm-hmm.
life, what was their lifestyle, were they young, were they old, did they have a family, were they living in a rural area or more in an
Mm-hmm.
urban setting? So I do think these are just all very important things to consider, I think,
Yeah.
when we talk about the HSP
Mm-hmm.
experience, and yet they all had, I think there were common themes like,
Mm-hmm.
the work around intense emotions, the tendency to feel overstimulated, the work around self-criticism or self-worth, if they grew up with a sense that they didn't live up to the male ideal, the masculine
Yes.
ideal, and obviously the more that was something experienced, the more they had it, they experienced it later in life. And then
Mm-hmm.
also, just maybe making some lifestyle changes, because some of them just really didn't, um, you know, felt they weren't in a position of making some changes. There was more in line with their sensitive disposition. So we looked at that. So basically, those three areas I
Mm-hmm.
identified, despite all the differences.
Right. Those tend to be universal.
I mean, just based on those
Yeah.
interviews and
Mm-hmm.
based on what I knew then, I mean, because I wrote the book a while ago, but back then that really seemed, to be the current thread, the common thread running through the interviews.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think a few of those are relatable for, I think, every HSP lifestyle and
Absolutely.
relationships, who you're spending time
Yeah.
with, how you're receiving support. I'm wondering if you could talk more about the male ideal. That's a unique experience for an HSP male, this striving to meet the expectation of masculinity. So could you speak more about that experience?
Yeah, so I basically, when I started writing the book, I felt it was really important to place the experience of highly sensitive men in the wider context, and by that I mean I wanted to look at mental health in men, and I wanted to look at the research. So therefore, the first half of the book is quite theoretical, and I wanted to summarize the research done on sensitivity at the time because it just
Mm-hmm.
felt very important to me. And then the second half, I think is then the more practical part of the book where I offer loads of activities and exercises that can be
Mm-hmm.
done by men or women
Mm-hmm.
friendly and or and non-binary individuals, or I mean for everyone really. Um, and I just sort of felt as I was reading more about the research on mental health and men, I just noticed just how dire the situation really is when it comes to mental health in men, and in terms of depression, in terms of addiction, in terms of suicide, in terms of getting in, ending up in prison or getting in touch with, unlawful behavior, or
Mm-hmm.
um, it's really quite striking. And but I also read then more and more about how, on the one hand, those men who have internalized the more a man has internalized those traditional, what we still see as traditional masculine values, the more likely they are to develop mental health issues in life, and the more likely they are to develop depression.
Mm-hmm.
So it is, still this belief, to be. I mean, obviously it changes, but I think there's still in the air, and around us, the sense of men should be stoic, and they should be not
Mm-hmm.
emotional, and if they are emotional, maybe anger is allowed as the emotion, but not much else, and they should be self-reliant, and they should be straight, and they should be, I mean, all these aspects, and they shouldn't ask for help, which is obviously something that we still see, when it comes to men not going to the GP to get tested, or when they're worried about getting ill, or for cancer, let's say, and
Mm-hmm.
all these aspects, or going, seeking a therapist if they need help. Again, it is, I think men just still have this. A lot of men. I don't want to generalize, obviously, too much. I'm generalizing, obviously, a lot here right now, but I think
Mm-hmm.
there's still the sense of it's just not quite part of the masculine ideal to be emotional, to ask for help, to be introverted, to to place a lot of emphasis on relationships in your life. And I just sort of felt that is something that I wanted to mention in the book because it is still around. And then in a similar way, when it comes to young boys, I read this really interesting study that mentioned that when boys don't live up to the masculine ideal, or the male ideal, whatever that
Mm-hmm.
means at their age, they're more likely to get bullied
Mm-hmm.
physically or emotionally in school. There's a really, I think the APA published this really interesting guidelines on working
Mm-hmm.
with men and boys, I think 5 years ago now. They might have published a new one since, but I just remember this very clearly as I was talking about the book, reading about the research mentioned in those guidelines, and I just think, and it just sort of shows how this sort of masculine ideal is still around, and I think can cause a lot of suffering,
Mm-hmm.
not just for men and boys, but also obviously for their partners and for their families, for all of us, really, right? I mean,
Right.
it's all connected,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, men really are suffering in a lot of ways. I mean, women were emotionality is accepted in us.
Mm-hmm.
But with men, you have to keep everything inside and always be strong, at least in most families, or in a lot of
Yeah,
families, in a lot of
yeah,
cultures. Um, and it does lead to some pretty dire results.
yes,
And you're right, it does
yes,
trickle out. It's not just for them, it's for their families, for their coworkers,
yeah,
for society.
yeah.
Yeah.
absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. And I still have it, I also think it's just so interesting how often, when men come together, how they don't really talk about emotional things.
Yeah.
I mean, I just experienced this the other day.
Hmm.
I went to a swimming lesson of our son and had a very nice chat with other dads. But I
Mm-hmm.
did realize at one point, all we talk about here is just politics and the weather, really, and
Right.
the holiday plans. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's a place and
Mm-hmm.
time for that. But I just sometimes think, and I think this is where maybe sensitive men come in. And maybe that is where, their role, that is, I think, maybe a role they could have is by introducing
Mm.
maybe a little bit more emotions or
Yeah.
topics that are personal or maybe have a bit of depth or a bit of, not obviously politics can also be deep, but I just mean in terms of, something with a little bit
Right.
more emotionality in it. And maybe
Mm-hmm.
that is something that men could, sensitive men can introduce and maybe therefore normalize it also in those conversations. And maybe we'll all come away from those conversations feeling a little bit better afterwards.
Yeah.
Yes, we talk about politics and the weather, but maybe then also about something else that has a little bit more to
Right.
it.
Right.
Um,
Something more vulnerable or related to your internal experience.
yeah, absolutely, exactly. That's exactly the right word. This sort of, talking. Let's talk a bit more about it into our internal experiences, and let's normalize that not just
Yeah.
in the therapy setting, not just in
Mm-hmm.
the consulting room with your therapist, but maybe also with your male friends.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be quite a healthy thing to you know to develop.
Absolutely. Sensitive men could be the emotional leaders for other men.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that was sort of at least what I thought about when I wrote the book. I think that is a role that is that the highly sensitive men could doesn't have to, of course, but maybe that is a quite a valuable role.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, as you're standing in this circle of dads at the swimming lesson, do you feel an urge to maybe deepen the conversation, bringing it back to that depth, or does it
Yeah,
is
April,
it
I'm
not
not
the
very good
place?
at. I'm not. No, no, no. The opposite. I'm not very good at just keeping it light and lovely.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I obviously, then and then what is chicken and egg? Is it because I'm a therapist? Is it because
Sure, right.
I'm sensitive? But who knows? But I obviously, I'm someone who then quite quickly asks more personal questions,
Mm-hmm.
or if I mean, I don't know how you feel, but it often bores me a little bit, if I'm
Oh,
honest. I
yes. I
often,
feel very empty.
yeah. so, and again, there's nothing, and I had a really nice chat, with them, but I just sort of, after a while, I have to ask a slightly more personal
Sure.
question. Otherwise, it just feels a bit,
You can't help it.
no, I can't help it. So I am someone who asks questions, but similar to coming back to what we discussed earlier, of course, I'm also, as I get older, I'm also aware that
Hmm.
there's a place and time for it, and
Sure.
not every person is interested in having that conversation or this kind of conversation. Some might find it threatening, or some might
Hmm.
find it too personal, and that is okay too, right? I mean,
Hmm.
it's but I think in terms of my own tendencies, I think I'm much more willing to ask, questions, obviously. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, just let's go deep.
yeah,
As soon
yeah,
as possible. That's always
yeah,
I think, my point of view. But yeah, leaning back when you can tell people aren't
yeah,
receptive to it.
yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
And then and being aware of it, exactly, not sort of
right.
steamroll
Steamrolling.
them,
Yeah.
exactly. Just being aware, then yeah, maybe this is not the moment, or
Yeah.
maybe it's okay to step back a little bit. Yeah.
Hmm. And then maybe seek it elsewhere to make sure that need gets met.
Seek it elsewhere, and I think that's comes back to what I said earlier. I do feel in my life, thank God, I have those people
Hmm.
around me, and I had them basically since childhood, really,
Hmm.
to be honest. So I do feel, I've got those, I've got people around me where I can seek that depth. So it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be, you know, the other dad is at the swimming pool,
Right.
but but it could be.
It could be, right. I love it. Uh, thinking about, let's say you're not a highly sensitive man, but you have one in your life. Maybe it's your son, your husband, your brother, your father. What is, how can we start to support those men in our lives?
Mm. I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it? But
Yeah, it's a
I
big
do.
question.
It's a big question. No, but it's a good question. It's a good question, obviously, and it's a question that I often get asked,
Yeah.
and I do sometimes get emails from readers,
Mm,
who bought my book, and often because they want to understand someone better who they think is highly sensitive, and they then want to read about it. And I think it's, first of all, I think for those people themselves, it's important to know about it and to know the research, and to know
mm,
that, yes, there's a lot of stuff we don't know about it yet, but there's also an
yeah.
awful lot we do know. And I think
Mm,
that's what I often say in interviews. I just feel like it's not like we're starting from scratch completely.
right.
There's been done some really thorough research on this,
Mm,
since the 90s. Um, but I do think, it depends on what the highly sensitive person in their life is struggling with. So how we support them. I think that depends on what do they struggle with? At which stage are they? Do they still struggle with the whole coming to terms with them, that they might be more sensitive than their other friends or other people in their lives? Or is it about, something very specific? Is it more like, oh, the person struggles with their sensitivity at work or in their relationships? Or I think it really depends. But I think, broadly speaking, I would say, support them by knowing something about it yourself, and by not shaming them,
yeah.
for being emotional or sensitive.
Mm,
That doesn't mean, we all, I mean, I think, again, I think, of course, if you're very emotional, very sensitive, I think it is your responsibility to, to look
mm,
after that yourself. It
yes.
can't turn into other people's responsibility. But of
Yeah.
course, we're not living in a vacuum, and we live surrounded with other people, and we need, ideally, their, acceptance and their
Mm,
support. So I think acceptance and non-shaming approach
mm,
to uh, thoughts and feelings are important. And I see this particularly also with young children. I mean, I don't work with children, but I often think, when children ask other questions, that's a good thing, right?
yeah.
Surely. So I think one way
Mm-hmm.
to support, a highly sensitive boy or a highly sensitive girl could be just to
Yeah.
very much embody that, that,
Yeah.
yes, I like that you ask questions. I like that you think about this, or,
Mm-hmm.
help them obviously to regulate their feelings. That doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
we have to, you know, yeah, I think that is a way to support highly sensitive people in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, hopefully you would do with any person, really see them, meet them where they are, find out what they're struggling with and how you can be a support while also encouraging them, at least if they're adults, to take action on their own behalf, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I think that is really important, that we, and I do talk a lot in the book about self-compassion, and obviously in terms of, we talk about emotional regulation. I think mindfulness can be one aspect, but I mean, there are many other ways of trying to regulate our feelings. And I think, starting more self-compassionate or more self-learning, a more self-compassionate approach can be another one. But I think also self-compassion can be, um, firm with ourselves. I mean, a
Mm-hmm.
compassionate approach can also be firm. It doesn't have to be always like,
Right.
um, so that just is something that I think is just important to highlight.
Mm-hmm. And can you clarify when you say firm, self-compassion, what does that mean?
Yeah, yeah. I just sort of feel like we can be, when we find ourselves maybe in situations as a highly sensitive person where we struggle with something, and don't want to do something. Let's say we want to avoid a situation because we find it challenging, because maybe it's very overstimulating, or because it's really doesn't sit well with our, most of us are introverted, I think, and and it doesn't sit well with that. I do think we can be compassionate and supportive to ourselves, but I think we can also maybe at one point say to ourselves, not let ourselves off the hook all the time. I think there is again a balance between, yes, this is difficult, and acknowledging what you're feeling, and trying to work out what it is, what a nurturing response to your own feeling could be in that moment, in order to nurture your sensitive side, or the side in you that needs nurturing or looking after from you. But I think you can also maybe encourage this side to take action, or remind this side that that you can do it, or what I mean. It sounds so blasé, not blasé, it sounds so simplified now when I say it, but I think, you know what I mean? I think that's sort of finding that balance between yes, and I'm here, and I'm let's do this, let's try to do this together, but also let's try to do it together. Now let's do it together, let's do it, sort of.
Exactly. Yeah, not letting yourself get stuck in that mindset of, this is a burden, I'm incapable as a sensitive person, but finding that balance. How can you be active in your life, engaged in your life, without letting the sensitivity really topple you?
Exactly.
There can be a balance.
Exactly. That's exactly it. You put that much more eloquently.
Oh no, I'm just reflecting back what you said.
No. But it's exactly, that's what I tried to explain with many words. That's what I tried to say.
Yeah, we're here just reflecting each other. Tom, if you could leave listeners with one message of encouragement, what would that be?
Yeah. Well, I think what I always try to say really is, find out what you're struggling with related to your sensitivity. I mean, I'm sure there is, maybe there are some aspects that you find particularly difficult, and think about whether you need help for them, or whether you need to, work on those areas that you feel maybe hold you back. I think we don't need to put ourselves out there if you don't want to. We don't need to become, extroverted, but I think if it holds you back, and if there is something you actually want to do, but because of your sensitivity, and maybe, if it blends into shyness or introversion, you're not doing it, I think then I would encourage seeking help, or working on it in whatever that is, whatever is possible. Not everyone can afford therapy, or pricey consultations. So it might just be, joining a group, or reading a book, or reading blogs, or whatever, practicing things yourself. And on the other hand, on the flip side, I think what I talked about earlier is really just to enjoy, the positive aspects of sensitivity, and by that I really mean, that extra level of the seeking depth, really, seeking depth, and that particularly, that sort of sensitivity towards nature, that sensitivity towards the arts often. I mean, I think that is so enriching, and I think I would really, really, try to enjoy those aspects as much as possible, and not shame yourself for being maybe a bit more emotional than other men or other women, or a bit more sensitive than others. And I think that strikes me as really the core message, really, right? Because so often I think particularly men do feel some shame around it.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't miss the beautiful parts of sensitivity.
Yes.
And also look at where you in particularly struggling. It's probably not sensitivity itself, it's maybe one aspect where the sensitivity intersects. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think absolutely, because I think, I mean, again, I think it depends sometimes on where people are in their process, and sometimes people are very much at the beginning, and they just come to terms with the whole idea that they might be highly sensitive. But I think for others, it's very specific things. It might be, a relationship, or it might be going to a party, or not wanting to go to a party, or whatever it is, or feeling, the question around, how many children to have or having any children really, feel very sensitive. So I think there are often some very specific questions, that come up that might need addressing.
Yeah, and using your depth of processing to dive into those questions can be really
Yes, exactly.
fruitful. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation. It's been
You're very
really great
welcome.
sitting with you.